my screen here. Ooh, okay. So, okay, can everyone see this here?
Yes.
Okay, just let's bring it up here. Okay, there we go. So my name is Clarissa, and I'm a physiotherapist at Mend Physio in Leslieville. And today I'm going to be just chatting about bike injuries and kind of the common injuries that I see as a physio and how to prevent them. I'll touch on a little bit about bike fit as well. So just, I guess most people aren't showing themselves. I was going to get a show of hands of who's more of a road cyclist versus a mountain biker versus a CX rider. Feel free to throw your hands up if you are visible and are a road rider primarily. Perfect. Any mountain bikers here? All righty. Okay, so before we dive into the content, I'll just chat briefly about myself. I am a physiotherapist. I did an undergrad in kinesiology, so I do have a background in all of the kin domain to a degree in terms of biomechanics, anatomy, physiology, and that sort of thing. Currently, my practice is at Mend, where I focus primarily on a little bit of manual therapy, a little bit of dry needling, and a lot of strength and conditioning. So that's where my passion lies in terms of using strength and conditioning as a way to get people feeling better and to prevent injury. So a couple fun facts about bikes. I like all bikes. I love just being on two wheels. My first real bike was a road bike, which I have behind me with a ridiculous red saddle here. But I primarily mountain bike these days. So that's kind of my focus. I know as a club, Dark Horse is primarily road, gravel oriented. So I'll spend most of the time chatting about injuries related to that. Little fun fact, I am able to ride a unicycle, but I cannot manual on my mountain bike, which blows my mind. So here are some fun photos of me doing what I love most. The only photo I have of a gravel race is a broken derailleur hanger that led me to run the last 5K. So not so successful in the road gravel department. Okay, so elements of staying injury-free. There's a couple things that are a bit outside of the scope of physiotherapy, but I do want to touch on them because they're incredibly important in terms of both preventing injury and actually recovering quickly and recovering well. And those are the couple topics at the top there. So everyone can see those: nutrition, sleep, recovery, how our general mental state is. Those all impact how well we can recover on and off the bike. So please make sure you take care of those elements. Speak to the right professionals there, whether it be a dietitian, naturopath, psychologist. All these people can really help with injuries, physical injuries. So where physio comes into play is more so threefold, right? So we can comment on bike fit just based on our knowledge on anatomy, physiology, joint mechanics, biomechanics, that sort of thing. But at an elite level, often a professional bike fit does really come into handy here. Another role that we do play is more in the training volume side of things. So when it comes to injuries involving repetitive load or repetitive use, it's often due to training error. And that's something that we can chat a bit more about, and we will chat more about as we talk about the injury. So does anyone know what load and capacity are in relation to rehab or strength and conditioning? Any show of hands? No. See some head shakes. Okay, so load is basically the total volume of work. That can involve, the mileage you're doing, the total mileage in a week, in a given ride, elevation, the surface you're riding on. So riding on gravel versus road is going to be incredibly different in terms of the effects on the body. And then when it comes to capacity, that's our body's total ability to do work. So it might mean our whole body as a system, or it might mean one part of our body, say our hamstring muscle. So why is this integral to understand? Basically, all chronic injuries happen when our load exceeds our capacity. So what prehab is basically building up our body's capacity, whether that be the capacity in our quads tendon, our hamstring, our shoulders, right? It's building up this whole body capacity such that our capacity is higher than the demands or the loads of our training, right? So that we have that buffer zone. And in doing so, we greatly reduce our risk of sustaining those chronic type of injuries. Does anyone have a question about that or need clarification? Okay. So few common areas of injury. I didn't want to call them injuries per se, more so areas of injury, because we're not going to get into the nitty gritty of, specific structures, but I'm just going to break them down by body part in terms of what I commonly see. So the first, before we get into that though, I'm going to just chat super quickly about really basic bike fit here. I wonder if, okay. I might demonstrate on the bike if anyone needs me to, but otherwise, just for the sake of not switching in and out of the slideshow, we'll keep it as is, but please stop me if you want me to show on the bike, because I do have it here. So one thing is we want the saddle at such a height that our knee is actually bent or flexed to about 25 to 30 degrees in the bottom position when our foot is in the 6 o'clock position. Fore and aft refer to the front to back position of the saddle. And we want it such that when our feet are level or the crank arms are level, the front foot, the front knee should be directly over the ball of the foot, not further ahead and not further back. So that's just a nice starting point. And when it comes to cleat positioning, this is a fun thing you can try right now if you're sitting on something high enough that your feet can dangle. If you just let your feet hang, you can see where your feet lie in terms of what direction they're pointing. Not everyone has, feet that point directly forward. One might turn out a little bit more, and that might be a good starting point in terms of where to set up your cleat, because we don't really want to fight your natural anatomy or orientation too much, right? And the last thing I'll talk about is just the angle under the arm here. So when we're kind of resting on the handlebars, we want this angle here from the arm down to our trunk here to be just under 90 degrees. And that just puts our shoulder in an optimal position to work and to absorb load. Okay, does anyone have questions or need me to demonstrate that at all on the bike? Okay. Perfect. So we'll get into the injuries. The first one here is neck pain. How many people have experienced neck pain while on the bike? Perfect. Yeah, a few people here. It's a very common one, especially amongst road cyclists more than mountain bikers, just based solely on the nature of the position, right? So you're going to be in that kind of hunch forward position with your neck in prolonged extension, meaning your head is kind of cocked upwards to be able to see where you're going. So with that prolonged extension, we want the neck itself to be able to sustain that posture, but we also want a lot of shoulder girdle strength. So the more support we have through that whole shoulder region, it can include our lats, our rotator cuff, up into the traps. The more support we have there, the less load, again, goes into the neck. When we speak about bike fit, obviously, there's a balance between performance and comfort. So at a certain point, do you want to slam your stem, or do you want it a little bit higher so you don't have to kind of crane your neck up? That's a decision you kind of have to make for yourself. But definitely when it comes to gear, we can make some easy modifications. So sunglasses, it's a super simple topic, but if you think about it, if your glasses or sunglasses are kind of sliding off your face a bit, I see this commonly in women and youth athletes because their faces are a little bit smaller, right? You end up losing that sight above the top rim, right? So you end up poking your chin out even more to see. So just making sure you don't have anything in the way, your visor or cap isn't obstructing your view. That's a super simple way. It might, only mean a few millimeters of space difference, but that might mean a lot for your neck mechanics. When it comes to prehab, we have these muscles deep inside our neck that help to stabilize. They're kind of the core muscles of the neck. And those are often muscles that are a little bit weaker in a lot of people. So simply doing a bit of a chin nod, you guys can try this with me now. If you do a little bit of a chin tuck here, you should feel the muscles kind of deeper in the throat engage without these outside muscles turning on or flexing. So it shouldn't be like all these muscles popping out of your neck. It should be deeper inside. You have a better chance of feeling it for yourself if you actually put the tip of your tongue on the roof of your mouth and then kind of engage. Okay, so those are some muscles that with, you know, the guidance of a physio, we can start to activate and strengthen even. And then I'm going to speak about shoulder girdle and kind of the whole upper back, those paraspinal muscles running down the back. The more those support the head and neck, again, the less all of this has to work. And lastly, thoracic mobility. So that's our upper back. If you spend all day sitting at a desk, kind of hunch forward and then go onto a bike, spending another few hours kind of hunch forward, we tend to lose the ability for our upper backs to extend or arch backwards. So working on the mobility of that thoracic extension, that ability to arch back, will help you, because if you can see me here, I'm really kyphotic, really rounded forward at the upper back. I have to crane my neck even further to look up. Whereas if I have a bit more mobility through here, I'm not nearly as turtle shaped, right? I don't have to cock my neck back as far. So a little bit of thoracic mobility goes a long way here. Simple ideas on the bike. When it's safe to do so, do some neck stretches, get some movement in there. Motion is lotion. It helps to lubricate the joints and change up muscle posture. It, you know, just even offloading your hands if it's safe to do so will also kind of decrease all of that force going through the neck. And then a little bit of those chin tucks on the bike when you think of it. Okay, so moving on from that, who here has experienced low back pain on the bike? Yep, so another common injury here, or area of pain. So back pain is quite complex. It can be caused by numerous different things, but ultimately it comes down to prolonged posture again, same with the neck. So it's an issue of too much too soon. It's often more likely to be muscle, joints, and ligaments, less the scary things that we all come to think of when it comes to back injuries. In terms of bike fit, saddle tilt is really important. I think there's a question here. I think that's what the hand means. Is that, Kyra, do you have a question? Maybe not. Okay, let me know if anyone has a question.
No, I just put my hand up to say that I had lower back pain. Sorry about that.
Okay, perfect. It just stayed up and then I didn't see it till after. So
Sorry, I'm keeping my video off, so sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you for participating. Okay, so when it comes to bike fit, having appropriate tilt in the saddle, forward and backwards, is important because it facilitates appropriate pelvic tilt. We want our pelvis in a relatively neutral position, so not kind of rolled forward where our back is really arching, and not really tucked back so our tail is underneath us. And bike fit is just a part of that, whereas, you know, I'll get into the prehab stuff, but we'll get into that further. It's a little bit of bike fit, a little bit of strength and mobility. Saddle height is also very important. So has anyone accidentally had their saddle too high and noticed what has happened? You basically end up reaching for the pedals with your foot, right? And what happens is you get this extra side to side motion of your pelvis, which kind of just torques all the musculature in the joints of the spine in a lateral direction, and it can irritate things. So just having that bike saddle at the appropriate height is a really important and simple thing to do. When it comes to strengthening though, this is where cyclists, I think, I've had so many cyclists come in and say, oh, my core is weak, that's why my back hurts. Not quite as simple as that, okay? But it does play a role. If we can't support our lumbopelvic area, so our low back or pelvis region, we tend to kind of slump into sustained postures that maybe are, you know, suboptimal. And again, we stick into that position for potentially hours on the bike. So having enough strength in the whole back side of your body, your posterior chain, is also really important. Our back muscles, our glutes, our hamstrings, these are all the supporting musculature that is really important. And something as simple as, you know, a glute bridge or a single leg glute bridge can be a good starting point for developing that strength in the backside. Hip and pelvis mobility, that's another big one. So when it comes to mobility, most people are usually okay. It's usually more the strength issue that I see day to day in clinic, but if our hips cannot flex, let me just show you quickly here. Flex meaning come upwards, so our knee coming up to our chest. If that mobility there is not so great into the hip region, what happens is, you can imagine it right at the top of the pedal stroke. If your knee has a hard time coming up because of the hip joint in particular, our backs have to slumber around to be able to get that knee high. And that's even more so the case if you're in an arrow position. So having that hip flexion mobility is something definitely to work on. Okay, and then long-term, just building up time in the saddle is important. Don't do too much too soon, and your back would in most situations just adapt and feel a lot better just progressively training it. So who here has had knee pain of any sort? Good, yeah, another very common area. And for those of you, have you had pain in the front of the knee? You can throw up a hand. Yeah, okay, so again, very common theme here is basically there's more force on this body part, more than your body has adapted to. Why does this happen? So it's usually either poor strength in surrounding musculature in relation to the quads, for example, when it comes to anterior knee pain. So your quads might be nice and strong, little weaker in through hamstring and glute, you're not getting enough contribution from the other muscles. Or you might have insufficient capacity in through the structures that are actually injured. So that might be in cases of front of the knee pain, your quads tendon, your patellar tendon, you might be overloading the kneecap itself because of all the forces going through there that your body hasn't built up to. So very commonly, cyclists with anterior knee pain will have their saddles a little too low or saddle slammed forward. So that puts a lot more stress on the knee, and stress isn't a bad thing if you've adapted to it, but for most people, it does overload those anterior structures, and you run into things like patellofemoral syndrome or runner's knee, patellar tendonitis, those types of things. The other thing is cleat position. So we talked about having your foot in an optimal position because that will also allow your knee and your hip to sit optimally. So making sure your knee is not coming inwards and so on. When it comes to strengthening, we do again want to do a lot of glute strengthening for sure. So anything where you feel your backside working in a strength environment is going to be helpful. And then actually building up the local capacity of that quads tendon is important. Something really isolated and local would be, you know, a leg extension. So a seated leg extension is a great way to target that if you're not familiar with, you know, squats and more compound movements. And more along that note, we do want to strengthen the lateral hip. So does anyone know what I mean by the lateral hip or the gluteus medius? You can shake your head no or throw up a hand yes. Okay, so it's basically the muscle on the side of our bums, okay? It plays a huge role in stabilizing the pelvis. And when we don't have that strength in the side of our butt, the knee often comes inwards. So you might have noticed that even yourself on the bike, as you're pedaling, the knee keeps caving in towards the frame. It might even contact the top tube. And that speaks to that hip strength. And what happens is when that knee drives inwards, our kneecap and our femur basically rub and get irritated. And that can often cause that pain in the kneecap itself. Not because you're overloaded in the tendons or anything like that, but simply based on mechanics and getting that inwards motion. So temporarily on the bike, you can try a higher cadence. You're going to get that same power output with decreased torque on the knee. But that's kind of a band-aid effect. You want to address the cause ultimately. Is everyone doing okay so far? Okay, awesome. So Another area of common knee pain is on the inside. Has anyone had that inner knee pain? No, not as common. So this is more in relation to that lateral hip strength. Okay, so when we see again that force strength in the side of the butt, we get that inwards rotation of the knee and more stress on that inside of the knee. So I actually want everyone, if people want to stand up and try a single leg squat here. No pressure. I see some smiles. Maybe some people want to give it a shot. And pay attention to what your knee does. Try to get as low as you can, if you can, without losing your balance. Okay. So, how did it feel? Did it feel good, bad, stable, unstable, kind of iffy? So basically a single leg squat is something I look at as a physio, not because everyone's going around throwing down single leg squats, but because it speaks to what we need to do when we run, when we bike, every time we push down, right? And if we use that as a guide, you might find, hey, I feel really wobbly, and that's probably because your glute isn't doing a great job of stabilizing you at the hips. And what happens again on the bike, that knee goes in, you do it thousands of times over the course of a ride and things get irritated. That's all it is really. So when it comes to physio and rehab, it is important to identify which structure is affected. It might be your hamstring tendon. It might be a structure kind of on the shin called the pes anserine. Different structures require different types of rehab, but almost always a little bit of single leg strengthening, a little bit of glute strengthening goes a long way. The other thing is bike fit, right? So we talked about how we want that fore aft position to be such that your knee is kind of over the ball of the foot. The reason for this type of pain is that if you're too far back, your hamstrings are pulled taut a little bit, and you get that yanking on the inner side of the knee, right where the hamstring, one of the hamstring tendons attaches. So that's a common one I see with cyclists. So just playing around with that position a bit, even a few millimeters can be enough to decrease that pull on the hamstring. Okay, so last knee area, the outside of the knee. So this is very similar in terms of the medial knee, the inner knee, in terms of what contributes. Again, it's that poor hip control, poor single leg control, but also one added factor, which is that often I find people are a lot stronger in their hip flexors, a little less strong in that outer glute area, meaning you tend to prefer to use those hip flexor muscles. Has anyone here heard of the IT band? So it's basically a band of connective tissue that runs down the side of the outer side of your thigh. And where it actually originates is up in the hip flexor area in a muscle called the TFL. So when this TFL is doing a lot of the work, because the glute isn't doing enough of the work, it yanks up on that IT band a little bit and can cause irritation. So that's another component where, again, glutes, it's all about the glutes today, but basically offloading specifically to the glute med can be really helpful so that you're not kind of overworking this poor little hip flexor that's just tugging on this IT band and causing issues down below at the knee. And then again, when it comes to knee position, you can imagine if your knee is not tracking vertically every pedal revolution, you're going to get that rubbing, that friction, that irritation. And it can be exacerbated if your saddle's too low, getting more of that knee bend than you need to be getting. Or if, again, your saddle's too high, too far back, you're getting more of that tug in the hamstring and you're getting more of that outside hamstring tendon irritation. Everyone with me so far? Okay. Does anyone want to try this side bridge with a clamshell hold, or are people done seeing some head shakes? Someone wants to. Okay, I'll go over it super quickly here. You're basically going to lie onto your side. And most people are probably familiar with a side plank, right? So this is a side bridge. I'll just describe it because I know a lot of people are done with exercise for the night. You're going to lie on your side, but from the knees instead of from the feet, and then still be resting on the forearm. Okay, so what that does as you get into that side plank is it loads that whole lateral chain, that outside of the hip area. And then if you open the knees, you get a bit of a bit more forces on the glute area. Okay, I can demonstrate at the end if anyone wants me to, if anyone's curious about this, but we'll move on from that one. Exercise prescription is very individual, but these are just some fun things you can try and, you know, test yourself, see, oh, do I feel strong there? Or do I feel really weak in those positions? So it's kind of just fun to play around with those. Okay, so moving on from the knee, has anyone experienced saddle region pain or numbness? So another common area, unfortunately, with cyclists. Again, it all comes down to force. So more force on that area, more pain, right? This is an area where you can't really train it out of it, right? So there's no training the soft tissue in that region, and there's no training the nerves out of numbness. So a lot of it comes down to bike fit. The saddle width is too narrow, you're not getting enough support in your sit bones, you're getting more compression kind of closer to the midline where a lot of the nerves sit. If you're getting into saddle height, too much height, you're getting that rocking pelvis, increased friction, increased irritation. So saddle with a cutout can be helpful, but that's again very individualized. When it comes to prehab though, this is where a lot of strength in your trunk and your pelvis area can be really helpful. So we can't train the saddle region itself, right? At least not very well. But what we can do is make sure everything through our core is supporting us, so we're not just falling into an anterior pelvic tilt with all the weight going into our soft tissues in front. We're not losing control of the pelvis rocking back and just dumping into our tailbone and compressing things there. So a lot of trunk strength and a little bit of pelvis mobility so you can rock in and out of those positions is going to be helpful. Hand numbness. Anyone here who have experienced hand numbness? Yeah. Can you point to where you felt it in the hand? Is it more the outside? Okay, yeah. So there's two commonly affected nerves with regards to the cyclist palsy. The ulnar nerve innervates these two fingers. So one, in theory, 1.5 of your fourth, and then the median nerve 3.5 of this on this side of the hand. So often when it comes to ulnar nerve, it's because we're compressing into this direction. So if you picture yourself riding in the drops, especially, right, that hand kind of ends up cocked backwards. And there's a lot of pull through the nerve here. And nerves don't like to be pulled. So you can think about bike fit and geometry. Do you need to ride in the drops? Can you rotate through various positions, going from the tops to the hoods to the drops, playing around with it? That's helpful. Bar width is actually really helpful, and you'll see this now in the gravel world, which is kind of carrying over into the road world a little bit, where you're seeing handlebars that are flared out a little bit, right? And that can help to offload that ulnar nerve, because now, how do I best show you this? You can kind of sit cocked back here instead of just kind of right in front and doing like a karate chop motion, right? It's more a natural resting position of the arm. When it comes to the median nerve though, so more of this area, it's more typically the impact of coming back like this. So often that will be combined, even riding, you know, in the drops, whatever position, you're going to get some element of wrist extension. So that, when it comes to bike fit, we want to think about potentially offloading a little bit more padding, a softer grip. Especially in the mountain bike world, there's a lot of impact, right? Especially if you're doing more enduro or downhill racing. So having a squishier grip can be helpful. But ultimately, again, it comes back to the trunk. We need that area of the body to take on most of the forces. This one I would speak with a physio with, or someone who can assess you and see actually what nerve is affected. Because not only can it be irritated or pinched down here, it might be coming from up the chain, even up into the neck area. So the shoulder girdle, the neck, those nerves come all the way from the spine itself and feed down, and anywhere along that pathway, it can be affected. So we want to kind of rule out any neck contributions before we discuss just hand positioning and bike fit in that manner. Make sense? Okay, so a little bit of mountain bike talk for a couple of people here who do ride mountain bikes. They can also occur with road and gravel if you take a tumble, unfortunately. So one of them is a clavicle fracture. You probably all know someone who's had a broken collarbone. Unfortunately, it's a really common one. Can't really avoid crashing too much, but the big thing I would say is just get on the rehab as soon as possible, because if you don't, they take a long time to get better, and mobility is often quite severely impacted if you don't take care of it. When it comes to a bit more of the repetitive strain injuries, that we see the rotator cuff very commonly affected, either from a crash, but more from overuse. So when speaking about bike fit, handlebar width, this is really key actually with mountain biking, because bars keep getting wider and wider, right? And at a certain point, that's really helpful for stability. But if we go too wide, right, and you picture doing a push-up out here, it's going to be super hard to do a push-up out here versus kind of bringing it in a little bit. So we basically want to maximize your biomechanical advantage to push and to pull. Too narrow is too unstable, it's too cramped up. Too wide, more stress through these regions of the rotator cuff. So you want to find that optimal width. For mountain bikers, a fun way to just decide what width to go with is get on the floor, do a push-up, measure where you comfortably can do a push-up in the strongest position, and use that as your bar width. So cut down your bars to that same width there. When it comes to shoulder girdle strength, I love bottom up kettlebell type of work. So for those who are not familiar, kettlebell upside down provides a lot of that wobble, right? That instability, and training movements like these oscillations kind of through range is really helpful. You can get into kind of upside down presses and that sort of thing. It's a great way to just work on all those little stabilizer muscles that are not just relevant for mountain bikers, although more so, but also road, because what you're doing on the road, what you're doing on any bike is stabilizing at the shoulder so that everything, your head and neck, can stay level, right? And we're absorbing force through the shoulder and the elbow. This is our natural suspension, right? In addition to our legs. So the more we can kind of create tension around the joint and stabilize, especially again under load, right? The more you can turn on those muscles and get them stabilizing you when you're on the bike. So that's one you can try out on your own at another time if you like. And just in general terms, it's really important to train 4 directions of movement for the shoulder. So that's your push and your push and your pull and your pull. So that would be, a push up or bench press, a row coming back, an overhead press, or a pull up or a lat pull down. Those are the major 4 movements that the shoulder needs to be able to do. And having equal balance amongst those 4 muscles will give you a really good starting point in terms of, not being too strong through the chest and not having enough rotator cuff strength, for example. It'll just keep you a little bit more balanced. And in theory, we actually want your pulling muscles to be stronger. So that's going to be your row to your bench press ratio. Which for a lot of people is actually quite the opposite. And we end up kind of having a lot of that rounded forward posture and a little bit less of that musculature to keep us back and open and supported. So when it comes to physio, how many people here have been to physio themselves? Okay, so quite a few people here. So you're quite familiar likely with the whole process, but basically a physio's role is to assess through your history and what your goals are and what your injury presentation is like into the actual movement screening, and identifying where you might be a little stronger, where you might be a little weaker is often a bit of a surprise for a lot of athletes who are quite active and quite fit. They might be quite surprised about certain muscles being, substantially weaker than others, or not quite having the hip mobility they thought they had. So identifying those in an objective sense can give you a good starting point in terms of knowing actually what to work on. And then we can, again, depending on the physio, get into a bit more of the bike fit and postural considerations on the bike and talk about, hey, how can we adjust different things to make you a bit more comfortable on the bike? Okay, so I know everyone wants a little bit of a takeaway. So 5 of my favorite things to focus on for cyclists. You probably guessed the first one because I talked about the lateral glute a lot. Exercise for the glute. People have probably done like leg lifts or clamshells, right? Those are your kind of common exercises for those areas, and it's a good starting point. But I find that it's often not enough, especially if you are performing at a higher level or doing hours on the bike. You need more weight-bearing exercises. So that's where we get into single leg control, which is a function of that glute strength. Some of my favorite single leg exercises are things like step ups with heavy weight, or single leg deadlifts, or single leg squats. Lunges kind of fall into that single leg-ish type of category. Anything that's more towards one leg is going to force that glute med on the side of your hip to work. So incorporating those types of movements is a simple way to get that glute going and to improve that single leg control so your knee isn't diving inwards. Any questions about that? Okay, core. Everyone thinks of the core. It's all something that we all want to strengthen, and often again, cyclists will come in and say, "Oh, my core is weak. I need to work on that." But it's not just your abs. It's a 360 kind of circle around our whole trunk area. So we want those abs, but we also want your back to be working hard. We want the sides to work. So that's going to be kind of your obliques and your QL muscle. But we also want the top and bottom of our trunk to be working, and that's our pelvic floor, and that's our diaphragm. So it kind of creates a box of sorts, and we need all of those muscles functioning together as the core in order to stabilize, and not just the core that everyone thinks about. The shoulder girdle we talked about, we really want to work that rotator cuff, whether you're a road cyclist or gravel or CX, we need that shoulder to support us. So again, those 4 movement planes of movement are really a good starting point, and then a little bit of more guided specific rotator cuff and lat work is always helpful. Last one, you guys probably jumped ahead and read this, deadlifts. Deadlifts are your best friend. As a cyclist, we spend a lot of time in a hinged position. If you picture it, it's really, in a sense, a deadlift position, right? So building strength there and resilience and capacity is going to really help functionally on the bike. And the bonus is that it really does work everything above, right? Even the shoulder girdle, the lats, that whole core, the 360 core. And then if you get into single leg deadlifts, you really work the lateral glute area. So those are kind of my favorites and favorite areas to focus on for cyclists. So lastly here, miscellaneous prehab thoughts. Most people ask about rolling, stretching, mobility. What I find clinically, most people have better mobility than they have strength or capacity. That's just what I've experienced as a physiotherapist myself. So if you have unlimited time, yeah, spend some time rolling out, stretching, doing some hip mobility and so on. But if you're short on time and you had to pick one over the other, I would go with strength, because you can't build that capacity we talked about at the start with rolling and stretching and mobility. You can supplement, your body's ability to get into good postures, right? If you have good hip mobility and good muscle length and so on. But you can't, unless you build that capacity, you're going to run into those overload, overuse type of injuries. And when it comes to warming up, a little more simple. I don't like to get too complex here with warm-ups. It's just get your muscles moving, bike at a low intensity, get things moving in the way that they would move on the bike, in the position they would work at during a training session, and just ease in nice and slow. And that's pretty simple there. So thank you very much to Dark Horse and to John and for everyone here for having me. It's been great to talk about bikes and injury prevention. Does anyone have any questions for me?
There were a couple of questions that popped up in the chat as you were going along. So,
okay. I don't know if I have.
Yeah. So
yeah.
One of the questions was, we talked about sort of strength and conditioning, and how does prehab with a physiotherapist compare or contrast to working with someone like a personal trainer?
Great question. So It really comes down to, there are very fantastic trainers. I've worked with them myself in previous jobs where I actually, there were trainers on staff and so on. And they were almost, they knew more than certain physios that I know. And those are the types of trainers that we want and we want y'all to go to. That being said, not all trainers are created equal. And sometimes there's a disconnect in terms of knowing when there's an injury, how to work around it, and what really is the root problem. And being able to identify those little muscle groups we talked about, testing individual rotator cuff muscles and all of that, a physio would be a little bit better equipped to kind of identify those structures at fault, right? And to be able to prescribe it. But I do like to work closely with a personal trainer so that, if a client has one, so that we're getting that full body long-term programming that a trainer will be much more specialized in, right? So having training blocks for years or months or whatever it might be, but then also supplementing it with more the types of training or rehab that you need specific to your injury. Hopefully that answers your question. Let me know if you want more clarification. Okay.
And there was another question earlier. I think it was around the time, perhaps you were talking about hand numbness. Somebody had asked about what if there's numbness in some of the smaller toes?
Good question. So toe numbness is another common injury here, or a common area of pain. So for the foot, numbness can come from a whole host of different places. So it can come from your low back. It can come locally from nerve compression in the foot. Commonly, I see if it is coming directly from the foot, it's often due to compression. So if the shoe itself is too narrow, you get compression in through the nerves there. It could be compression up at the side of the lower leg, actually, right? There's a nerve there, the peroneal, that runs down into the foot. So it's hard to say exactly what is causing that numbness. And that's where it's really important to identify where it's coming from and being able to address it based on footwear or mechanics. Is that knee driving the pain, or is your back driving the pain?
And there was one more. And for inner knee pain, how would you determine root cause?
Great question there. So there are quite a few structures in the inner knee, right? So commonly I see it is more that pes anserine. It's a structure where there's a confluence of 3 tendons that attach, and often those tendons themselves can get irritated, or the bursa underneath can get irritated and become a bursitis, or it might be that hamstring. So those are commonly what I see. And basically a physio's role is to identify that. So we can test different muscles, we can palpate just based on our knowledge of anatomy. Strength testing, does activating the hamstring hurt? Does activating the muscles that attach to that pes anserine hurt, right? There are different ways that we as physios can find the source of the pain. And then actually going back to why that area is affected, that might be, again, because of mechanics, your knees coming in, glutes not doing its job, or you're overloading them just because of training errors. That's kind of what we need to get into a little bit more. Any other questions? Yeah, Brody.
Yeah, sorry, I jumped in late, and I thought
No
this was.
problem.
I thought it was starting at 8 for some reason. So,
All
but
good.
I thought the stuff I heard was awesome. I used to, work in the bike world, and I used to do fits for people. And although I by no means am I the expert on it, what you were talking about, core, was really interesting to hear, because I used to always deal with clients trying to make them comfortable on a bike, and the biggest limiting factor we always ran into was that core and the flexibility and the ability to support themselves on the bike. So hearing you talk about it from a more educated level was interesting to hear. Okay, so that's why we were dealing with certain issues all the time and figuring out how to make them comfortable on the bike. And it was that core. It was cool.
Yeah,
it was really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good because you need to definitely tie in both aspects. You can't have a really terribly fit bike and a really good body in terms of that capacity. You need both, right? Working together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other questions or comments?
Hey, Clarissa. if you had to pick one more thing on top of nailing your nutrition, sleep, all of the major recovery items, what would you pick?
Outside of the physio scope, or?
Yeah, like I hear of compression, ice baths, you know, people
Okay.
getting to all of these, I would call them ancillary type techniques. So
Great
outside of that, if you
question.
still have the time, what would you pick?
That's a tough one. So in terms of the literature supporting like ice baths and heat, and it keeps changing, right? And ultimately there isn't really an answer, right? There is some science supporting how cold therapy can help recovery, actually, especially in women, just hormonally. There's a big benefit to cold therapy in general terms, especially during certain parts of the cycle. For general terms, though, I would say really it is the basics. And often we're saying, oh, what more can we do? But if you're sleeping well, eating well, and taking care of your mental health and training appropriately, you're pretty well covered. The other stuff is just kind of, you know, an added bonus that might make you feel better because you believe it feels better, truly. I don't know if that answers your question. It's a bit of a non-answer.
No, I totally get it. It makes sense because I keep reading conflicting arguments and whatnot as well. That's kind of why I asked.
Yeah, that's a great point. Ultimately, it's what feels good, right? If you hate the cold and it just makes you tense up after, then why bother ice bathing, even if there is a bit of a benefit there, right?
Yeah.
Any other questions?
No?
I think we might be all questioned out. Does anyone need me to demonstrate anything or have questions about specific exercises at all, or bike fit stuff? Okay, looks like we are potentially good.
I think so. Thank you very much for spending some time with us this evening. This is really awesome. I think a lot of it's stuff we kind of get, but it's nice to have somebody help us put it all together and really connect the dots. So thank you all. So thank you to the Dark Horse members who've shown up, and those that were invited by Mend. If you're cyclists, I'm going to make my plug for the cycling club. We are Toronto's friendliest cycling club. My partner's laughing, as is Ange. But if you're looking, you know, if you're new to group cycling and you're looking for a place to start, I would say that we're probably the place in the city to do that.
Perfect. Thanks so much for having me, John. I appreciate it. Looking forward to a little bit more collaboration with the world's friendliest cycling club.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Good night. Did I say the
Thank
word?
you. Bye.